Jake Morrison felt his stomach drop as the transport shuttle began its final approach to Kepler Station. Through the small window, he could see the massive structure growing larger by the second. The station looked like a giant wheel spinning slowly in the darkness of space, with thousands of lights twinkling across its surface like stars. He pressed his face closer to the glass and watched ships of all shapes and sizes moving around the station. Some looked like Earth ships with their metal hulls and simple designs. Others were completely different. One ship looked like it was made of crystal and glowed with a soft blue light. Another appeared to be alive, moving through space like a giant fish swimming through water. Jake took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves. He had trained for this moment for 3 years, but nothing could have prepared him for actually being here. He was the first human to be accepted into the Galactic Academic Exchange Program. The weight of representing all of humanity sat heavy on his shoulders. The shuttle docked with a soft bump, and Jake gathered his few belongings. He had packed light, bringing only his research materials, some personal items, and enough clothes for a few months. Everything else he would need was supposed to be provided by the station. As the airlock opened, Jake stepped into a corridor that was clearly designed for beings much larger than humans. The ceiling stretched high above his head, and the walkway was wide enough for several Earth vehicles to drive side by side. The walls were covered in symbols and writing from dozens of different languages, most of which looked nothing like any human script. The first alien he saw was standing behind what looked like an information desk. It was tall and thin, with smooth, gray skin and large black eyes. When it saw Jake approaching, it smiled, revealing rows of small white teeth. "Welcome to Kepler Station, human Jake Morrison," it said in perfect English, though its voice had a strange musical quality. "I am Information Officer Keln. Your translator device is working properly, I hope?" Jake touched the small device attached to his ear. "Yes, thank you. Everything sounds clear." "Excellent. The Cosmic Institute of Biological Sciences is located in Section 7. Follow the blue line on the floor, and you cannot miss it. Your quarters have been prepared in the human residential area. Your room number is displayed on your personal device." Jake looked down at the tablet-like device he had been given during orientation on Earth. Sure enough, his room assignment and a map of the station were displayed on the screen. "Thank you for your help. It is my pleasure. Enjoy your stay at Kepler Station, and welcome to the galactic community." Jake followed the blue line through corridors filled with beings from across the galaxy. He saw creatures that walked on 2 legs like humans, but also others that moved on 4, 6, or even more limbs. Some floated through the air without touching the ground. Others were so small they rode in mechanical devices that helped them move around the station built for larger species. Everyone he passed seemed friendly enough. Many nodded or made gestures that his translator told him were greetings. A few even spoke to him directly, welcoming him to the station and wishing him well in his studies. Jake began to relax as he realized that his fears about being unwelcome were probably unfounded. The university section of the station was impressive. The corridors here were lined with laboratories and lecture halls, each marked with symbols indicating what kind of research took place inside. Jake saw signs for departments he had never heard of, studying subjects that Earth scientists could only dream about. He found his assigned lecture hall easily enough. The room was enormous, built like an ancient Roman amphitheater but with modern technology integrated throughout. Rows of seats were arranged in a circle around a central stage, but the seats came in many different sizes and shapes to accommodate the various body types of galactic species. Jake made his way to a section marked with the human symbol and took a seat. He was surprised to find that he was the only human in the room. The other students represented at least 20 different species, some of which he recognized from his orientation materials and others that were completely new to him. A group of tall, graceful beings with translucent skin sat in one section. Jake remembered reading about them. They were called Etherians and came from a world with much lighter gravity than Earth. Near them sat several shorter, stockier beings that looked like they were made of living rock. These had to be the granite folk from the mineral-rich worlds of the Outer Rim. In another section, A cluster of insect-like beings clicked and buzzed to each other in their native language. Jake's translator was picking up fragments of their conversation, which seemed to be about the upcoming lecture. Near the front, several beings that looked like walking plants swayed gently, their leaves rustling in the artificial breeze of the station's air circulation system. Jake checked his schedule again. He was here for advanced predator-prey dynamics in galactic ecosystems, taught by Professor Zenthka of the Vorthan species. He had read about Professor Zenthka during his preparation. The Vorthans were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the galaxy, having achieved interstellar travel thousands of years before humans had even developed agriculture. The professor entered the lecture hall through a door near the central stage, and Jake got his first look at a Vorthan in person. Professor Zenthka stood nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and skin that seemed to shift colors constantly. Jake had read that Vorthan skin color indicated emotional states, but he had not realized how dramatic the effect would be in person. Currently, the professor's skin showed calm blues and greens, which Jake's orientation materials had told him indicated a state of academic focus and professional calm. The professor moved with flowing, graceful motions as it arranged its materials on the central podium. "Welcome, students from across the galaxy, to advanced predator-prey dynamics in galactic ecosystems," Professor Zenthka began. Its voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily through the large hall even without amplification. The universal translators made the words clear to every student regardless of their native language. "I am Professor Zenthka, and I have spent the last 40 years of my life studying how different species hunt, are hunted, and interact within their ecosystems. Today, we will begin our semester with what I consider to be the most fascinating case study in our entire galactic database." The professor's skin shifted to show flecks of yellow, which Jake remembered indicated excitement or anticipation. Around the hall, students from various species leaned forward in their seats, clearly interested in what the professor had to say. "We will be studying," Professor Zenthka continued, "the species known as humans." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He had expected to learn about alien ecosystems and non-Earth biology. He had not expected to become the subject of study himself. He looked around the hall and noticed that several students were now looking in his direction, clearly having spotted the lone human among them. Professor Zenthka activated the room's holographic display system, and suddenly the air above the central stage filled with a 3-dimensional image of Earth as seen from space. Jake felt a wave of homesickness wash over him as he saw his home planet rotating slowly in the artificial space above the lecture hall. "This," the professor said, gesturing with 2 of its 4 arms toward the image of Earth, "is the 3rd planet. From a yellow dwarf star in the outer spiral arm of what you humans call the Milky Way galaxy. By all standard measures, it should have produced a typical herbivorous species that achieves sentience through social cooperation and mutual defense against predators." Jake frowned slightly. That did not sound like how he would describe human evolution, but he decided to listen before making any judgments. "Instead," Professor Zenthka continued, its skin now pulsing with bright orange excitement, "it produced what may be the most successful predator species in the known history of our galaxy." The lecture hall fell silent. Jake felt every eye in. The room turned toward him, and he suddenly felt very alone and very far from home. Jake felt his mouth go dry as Professor Zenthka's words echoed through the lecture hall. The most successful predator species in galactic history? He looked around at the other students and saw that many of them were staring at him with what he could only describe as curiosity mixed with concern. The professor's skin had shifted to a bright, yellow color that seemed to pulse with excitement. Jake remembered from his briefing materials that yellow indicated strong interest or enthusiasm in Vorthans. He was not sure if that made him feel better or worse about the situation. "Now, class," Professor Zenthka continued, manipulating the holographic controls with 2 of its 4 hands, "let us examine this planet more closely and understand why it produced such an unusual result." The image of Earth expanded, showing detailed views of different continents and environments. Jake saw familiar landscapes from his homeworld, the African savannas, the Amazon rainforest, the Arctic tundra, and the vast oceans that covered most of the planet's surface. Observe the diversity of environments on this single world, the professor noted. Most planets that develop life tend to have fairly uniform conditions across their surface. A water world remains mostly water. A desert world stays mostly desert. But this planet has extreme variations in temperature, humidity, terrain, and available resources. Jake had never really thought about Earth being unusual in this way. To him, having deserts, forests, oceans, and ice caps all on the same planet had always seemed normal. But as he looked around the lecture hall at students from different worlds, he began to understand that Earth might be more special than he had realized. This environmental diversity created something very rare in galactic evolution, Professor Zenthka explained. It forced the dominant species to become incredibly adaptable. Most species evolved to fit perfectly into one specific environment. Humans evolved to survive in almost any environment their planet could produce. The holographic display changed to show early human ancestors moving across the African landscape. Jake recognized the scene from nature documentaries he had watched as a child, but seeing it presented as alien research data felt strange and uncomfortable. Notice their hunting technique, the professor continued, pointing with one arm while operating the display controls with another. They do not rely on speed like most pursuit predators. They do not use stealth like ambush predators. They do not overpower their prey with superior strength. Instead, they use a technique so unusual that most galactic biologists initially refused to believe it was real. The hologram showed a group of early humans following a large antelope across the savanna. The antelope would run fast for a short distance, then stop to rest. The humans would continue walking at a steady pace. When they got close, the antelope would run again, but not as far this time. The humans would keep walking. They are persistence. Hunters, Professor Zenthka announced. They simply follow their prey until the prey becomes too exhausted to continue running. A student from the crystalline species raised what Jake assumed was a hand, though it looked more like a cluster of geometric shapes. When the professor acknowledged the student, it spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. Professor Zenthka, this seems highly inefficient. Why would a species evolve such a wasteful hunting method when speed or strength would be much more effective? Jake found himself leaning forward, curious to hear the answer to this question. He had never really thought about human hunting techniques being unusual, but the student had a point. Why run for hours when you could just run faster? The professor's skin shifted to show patches of purple, which Jake remembered indicated deep thought or consideration. An excellent question, student Crystal Song Harmony. The answer reveals something quite remarkable about human biology. The display changed to show a comparison between human anatomy and the anatomy of other predator species from various worlds. Jake saw creatures with massive claws, others with incredible speed, and some with strength that could crush rocks. Most predator species have evolved one or two specialized advantages, the professor explained. Humans evolved something much more valuable, efficiency. They can travel farther on less energy than almost any other large species. Their bodies are designed for endurance rather than short bursts of activity. Jake looked down at his own hands and legs, trying to see himself the way these alien students might. He had always been proud of being in good shape, but he had never thought of his body as being designed for hunting. But the truly remarkable thing, Professor Zenthka continued, is what happened when they developed intelligence. Most predator species, when they become smart enough to make tools, use those tools to make their existing hunting methods more effective. A fast predator makes tools to help it run faster. A strong predator makes tools to hit harder. The display showed various alien species using tools that enhanced their natural abilities. Jake saw creatures using mechanical legs to run faster than any biological limb could carry them, and others wearing powered armor that multiplied their natural strength dozens of times. Humans did something completely different, the professor sighed, its skin now showing rapid shifts between yellow and orange that indicated extreme excitement. They used their intelligence to eliminate the need for specialized physical advantages entirely. The hologram changed to show humans using spears, then bows and arrows, then firearms. Jake watched his ancestors develop increasingly sophisticated weapons that allowed them to hunt prey much larger and stronger than themselves. They turned their persistence hunting technique into a mental rather than physical strategy, Professor Zenthka explained. They would track prey not for hours, but for days or even weeks. They would learn the habits and patterns of their targets. They would set traps and ambush in places where they knew prey would eventually appear. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand what the professor was describing. Humans had not just developed tools to help them hunt. They had developed the ability to outthink their prey. And here is where the story becomes truly fascinating, the professor continued. When most species develop agriculture and permanent settlements, they abandon hunting in favor of more reliable food sources. Humans did develop agriculture, but they never stopped hunting. The display showed human civilizations growing and spreading across continents. Jake saw cities being built, farms being established, and trade routes being created. But he also saw humans continuing to hunt, even when they no longer needed to for survival. They began hunting for sport, for practice, and for the simple pleasure of the chase, Professor Zenthka noted. They created elaborate rules and rituals around hunting. They told stories about great hunts and famous hunters. They turned hunting from a survival necessity into a cultural institution. A student from what looked like a plant-based species rustled its leaves in what Jake's translator indicated was a form of question-asking. Professor, surely this is not unusual? Many species maintain cultural practices from their evolutionary past. True bright leaf dancing, the professor replied. But most species maintain cultural practices that reflect their peaceful or defensive evolutionary history. Humans maintained and celebrated their predatory practices. And when they developed space travel? The professor paused dramatically, its skin shifting to a deep red color that Jake had not seen before. According to his translator, deep red indicated warning or danger. When they developed space travel, Professor Zenthka continued, they brought their hunting instincts with them to the stars. The holographic display changed to show human space exploration, rockets launching from Earth, space stations being built, and eventually colonies being established on other worlds. But now, seeing it through the lens of the professor's lecture, Jake began to see patterns he had never noticed before. Every human expansion into space had been methodical, persistent, and thorough, just like the persistence hunting his ancestors had used on the African savanna. Jake watched the holographic display with growing unease as it showed human expansion across Earth's surface. The images looked innocent enough at first glance. Groups of people moving from one place to another, building settlements and adapting to new environments. But Professor Zenthka's commentary was making these familiar scenes sound sinister. Observe their expansion pattern across their home planet, the professor said, its skin now showing a mixture of deep purples and blues that Jake's translator indicated meant scientific fascination combined with concern. Most intelligent species develop agriculture, establish a few permanent settlements, and then focus on improving the quality of life within those settlements. The hologram showed what Jake assumed were typical alien colonization patterns. Cities would be built in ideal locations with good resources and favorable climates. The population would grow within these cities, but the cities themselves would remain in the same locations for thousands of years. Humans followed this pattern initially, Professor Zenthka continued, but then they did something that we have never observed in any other species. They kept moving. The display changed back to show human migration patterns over thousands of years. Jake saw waves of people spreading out from Africa to Asia, then to Europe, and eventually to every continent on Earth. Even after establishing successful settlements, groups of humans would continue to push into new territories. They moved into environments that should have been impossible for their species to survive, the professor explained. The frozen Arctic, where temperatures drop far below what their bodies can naturally tolerate. Scorching deserts where water is scarce and the sun can kill. High mountain peaks where the air is too thin to breathe easily. Dense jungles filled with diseases and dangerous predators. Jake had always been proud of humanity's ability to adapt to different environments. But hearing it described this way made it sound almost obsessive. Why had humans felt the need to go everywhere, even places that were clearly not suitable for human life? In every case, Professor Zenthka continued, they found ways to not just survive, but to thrive in these hostile environments. They created tools, clothing, and shelters that allowed them to live comfortably in places that would kill most other species within hours. The hologram showed Inuit people building igloos in the Arctic, desert nomads navigating vast sand dunes, and mountain climbers reaching the highest peaks on Earth. Jake had seen these images before in history books and documentaries, but now they looked different. They looked like the systematic conquest of every possible habitat. But here is the most disturbing part of their expansion pattern, the professor said, its skin shifting to a warning red color. In every new environment they entered, the same thing happened to the native wildlife. The display changed to show a timeline of animal extinctions corresponding to human expansion. As humans moved into new areas, large animals began to disappear. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other species vanished from the timeline shortly after humans arrived in their territories. Wherever humans went, the largest predators and prey animals went extinct, Professor Zenthka stated, not gradually due to climate change or natural disasters, but quickly within a few hundred years of human arrival. And in every case, humans filled the ecological role that these extinct animals had previously occupied. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He had learned about the extinction of megafauna in school, but it had always been presented as a natural part of human development. Hearing it described as a systematic replacement of native species made it sound much more deliberate and threatening. Student from the insectoid hivemind species clicked out a question. Professor Zenthka, are you suggesting that humans deliberately drove these species to extinction? Not deliberately, Collective Mind Worker 7, the professor replied. But the result was the same whether it was intentional or not. Humans did not simply compete with existing predators. They replaced them entirely. They became the dominant predator in every ecosystem they entered. The hologram showed modern Earth, with humans occupying every continent and dominating every major ecosystem. Jake could see cities, roads, farms, and industrial complexes covering much of the planet's surface. From this perspective, Earth looked like a planet that had been completely conquered by a single species. But the most remarkable part of their story, Professor Zenthka continued, is what happened when they ran out of new territories to explore on their home planet. The display shifted to show rockets launching from Earth. Jake saw the early space missions, satellites, space stations, trips to the moon, and eventually missions to Mars and beyond. He had always thought of space exploration as humanity's greatest achievement, but now he was beginning to see it through different eyes. They looked up, the professor said simply. When there were no more unexplored places on their planet, they decided to explore the universe itself. Jake realized that his hands were shaking slightly. The professor was describing space exploration as just another phase of human expansion, no different from the prehistoric migrations that had brought humans to every corner of Earth. Most species, when they achieve spaceflight, are content to establish a few colonies within their home star system, Professor Zenthka explained. They focus on sustainable development and maintaining communication with their homeworld. They expand slowly and carefully, taking time to fully develop each new settlement before moving on to the next. The hologram showed what appeared to be typical alien space colonization. A few ships would travel to nearby planets, establish small outposts, and then spend decades or centuries developing those outposts into stable colonies. The expansion was slow, careful, and methodical. Humans followed a completely different pattern, the professor continued. In their first century of spaceflight, they launched over 15,000 separate missions. They sent probes to every planet in their solar system, established mining operations on asteroids, and built colonies on every world that could possibly support human life. Jake watched the display show the explosion of human space activity. Hundreds of ships launched every year, heading to Mars, the asteroid belt, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and eventually to other star systems. The scale of human space exploration suddenly seemed almost frantic compared to the measured approach of other species. "They are persistence hunters on a galactic scale," Professor Zenthka declared. Just as their ancestors followed prey across continents for days or weeks, modern humans are following resources and opportunities across the galaxy for decades or centuries. The professor's skin was now showing rapid shifts between red and orange, indicating high levels of alarm and excitement. "And now, they have reached our territory." The hologram showed Jake's own journey to Kepler Station, along with the increasing number of human ships and outposts throughout the galaxy. Jake saw trade routes being established, diplomatic missions being sent to alien worlds, and human colonies being founded in star systems that had previously been the exclusive domain of other species. "Class," Professor Zenthka said, its voice carrying a weight that made every student in the hall pay attention, "we have just invited the most successful expansion-oriented species in galactic history to join our community. We have given them access to our star charts, our technology, our trade routes, and our worlds." The professor paused, looking directly at Jake for the first time since the lecture had begun. "We have, in essence, shown them the location of every resource, every opportunity, and every potential territory in known space." Jake felt as though every eye in the lecture hall was focused on him. He was no longer just a student attending a biology class. He had become a representative of a species that was apparently viewed as a potential threat to every other civilization in the galaxy. The silence in the hall was broken only by the various breathing, humming, and filtering sounds of different alien species. Jake realized that he was holding his breath, afraid that any sound he made might be interpreted as aggressive or threatening. "The question we must now ask ourselves," Professor Zenthka concluded, "is whether we have just welcomed new friends into our community, or whether we have just shown the greatest predators in the universe exactly where to find us." The silence in the lecture hall stretched on for what felt like hours to Jake, though it was probably only a few seconds. He could feel dozens of alien eyes studying him, and he wondered if any of them were reconsidering their decision to welcome humans into the galactic community. Professor Zenthka's skin had settled into a deep, pulsing red that Jake now understood meant danger or serious warning. "Let me share with you the most concerning data from our xenological studies," the professor continued, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Over the past 1,000 years, our research teams have studied more than 10,000 intelligent species across the galaxy. We have carefully documented their evolutionary paths, their social structures, and their expansion patterns." The holographic display changed to show a vast array of alien species from across the galaxy. Jake saw creatures of every imaginable shape and size, tall, graceful beings that looked like living trees, small, furry creatures with large eyes, aquatic species with fins and gills, and many others that were so different from Earth life that Jake could barely understand how they functioned. "Of these 10,000 species," Professor Zenthka explained, 97% evolved from herbivorous or omnivorous ancestors. These species developed intelligence primarily as a defense mechanism against predators. They learned to work together, to build safe shelters, and to avoid dangerous situations. Jake looked around the lecture hall and realized that most of the students probably came from these herbivorous species. They had evolved to be peaceful, cooperative, and focused on mutual survival rather than competition or aggression. "These species," the professor continued, "typically develop spaceflight as a way to find new resources or escape environmental problems on their homeworlds. Their expansion into space is usually slow, careful, and focused on establishing safe, stable colonies where their populations can thrive without conflict." The display showed examples of typical galactic colonization. Ships would travel to new worlds, carefully survey them for safety and resources, and then establish small settlements that would grow slowly over many generations. The process was methodical and peaceful, with little competition between different groups. 2% of intelligent species evolved from solitary ambush predators, Professor Zenthka said. These species developed intelligence to improve their hunting efficiency, but they retained their preference for working alone. They rarely develop spaceflight because they lack the social cooperation necessary for large-scale projects. Jake saw examples of these species: cat-like hunters, spider-like creatures that built elaborate traps, and others that relied on stealth and patience to catch their prey. He could understand why these species would have difficulty working together on something as complex as space exploration. That leaves less than 1% of intelligent species that evolved from pack hunters. The professor continued, its skin now showing a mixture of colors that Jake could not interpret. These species learned to work together to bring down prey larger than themselves. They developed complex communication, cooperative strategies, and the ability to plan coordinated attacks. The display showed several species that looked more familiar to Jake. They moved in groups, communicated with each other during hunts, and seemed to share some of the teamwork abilities that humans took for granted. Of these pack-hunting species, Professor Zenthka said, humans are the only known example of persistence pack hunters, achieving spaceflight while retaining their predatory instincts. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The professor was saying that humans were unique among galactic species, and not in a good way. A student from the plant-like species rustled its leaves in what Jake's translator indicated was a form of nervous questioning. Professor, are you suggesting that humans represent a unique threat to galactic peace? I am not suggesting it, bright leaf dancing. Professor Zenthika replied, its skin shifting to show patches of orange alarm. I am stating it as documented fact. Let me show you their behavioral patterns since achieving spaceflight. The hologram changed to show human space exploration and colonization efforts. Jake saw the rapid expansion of human settlements, the establishment of trade routes, and the development of space-based industries. But now, seeing it through the lens of the professor's analysis, everything looked different. Most species focus on sustainable development when they reach space, the professor explained. They establish colonies that can support themselves without depleting local resources. They develop technologies that work in harmony with existing ecosystems. They expand slowly to avoid disrupting established trade routes or territorial boundaries. The display showed examples of typical alien space development. Colonies were small and efficient, designed to have minimal impact on their environments. Trade was conducted through careful negotiations and formal agreements. Everything was orderly, peaceful, and respectful of existing arrangements. Humans have followed a completely different approach, Professor Zenthka continued. They establish colonies faster than they can properly supply them. They extract resources at rates that exceed natural replacement. They build space-based weapon systems that can destroy entire planets. Jake watched in growing horror as the display showed human military technology. He saw battle cruisers armed with nuclear weapons, orbital defense platforms, and planetary bombardment systems. He had always thought of these as necessary defenses against potential threats, but now they looked like the tools of an aggressive, expansionist species. Their first satellite was followed immediately by military applications, the professor noted. Their space program grew directly out of ballistic missile technology. Every human exploration vessel carries enough firepower to level major cities. The hologram showed the development of human space technology over time. Jake saw how rockets designed to carry nuclear warheads had been adapted for space exploration. He saw how every peaceful space mission included weapons and defensive systems that other species would consider excessive for exploration purposes. Even their scientific vessels are armed, Professor Zenthka pointed out. The ship that brought human Jake Morrison to this station carries weapon systems that exceed the total military capacity of 12 member species of the Galactic Council. Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment and shame. He had never thought about the weapons on his transport ship, but apparently they had been noticed and catalogued by alien observers. To them, even a simple passenger transport looked like a warship. But the most telling evidence of their predatory nature, the professor continued, is how they have responded to contact with galactic civilization. The display showed human diplomatic missions, trade negotiations, and cultural exchanges. At first glance, everything looked normal and peaceful. But Professor Zenthka began pointing out details that Jake had never considered. Within 6 months of first contact, they had mapped our major trade routes and identified our most valuable resources, the professor explained. Within 1 year, they had established competing businesses that undercut prices on 17 different commodities. Within 2 years, they had negotiated exclusive trading rights to 3-star systems that other species had been trying to access for decades. Jake realized that his own government had probably planned his presence at this university as part of a larger strategy to gather information about alien technology and capabilities. What he had thought was an educational opportunity was actually an intelligence-gathering mission. They approach every interaction as a competition to be won rather than a relationship to be built, Professor Zenthka observed. They negotiate every agreement as if they are hunting prey rather than establishing partnerships. The professor's skin was now cycling through rapid changes of red, orange, and purple, indicating extreme agitation and concern. Class, we are not dealing with a typical spacefaring species. We are dealing with apex predators who have learned to hunt on a galactic scale. Jake sank deeper into his seat as he realized that everything the professor was saying was probably true. Humans did approach every situation competitively. They did focus on winning rather than cooperating. They did carry weapons everywhere and extract resources as quickly as possible. The question before us, Professor Zenthka concluded, is what we should do about it. Jake Morrison sat frozen in his seat, waiting for Professor Zenthka to announce whatever solution the galactic community had decided upon for dealing with the human threat. He imagined trade restrictions, military containment, or perhaps even his immediate deportation from the station. The weight of representing his entire species pressed down on him like a physical force. The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as students from dozens of species whispered, clicked, hummed, and rustled to each other in their native languages. Jake's translator was picking up fragments of their conversations, and most of what he heard sounded fearful or concerned. Several students kept glancing in his direction, and he wondered if they were planning to avoid him after the lecture ended. Professor. Zentha raised all 4 arms for silence, and the hall gradually quieted. The professor's skin had been cycling through warning colors for the past several minutes, but now it began to shift toward something Jake had not seen before, a complex pattern of gold and silver that his translator indicated meant hope mixed with profound realization. However, the professor said, and that single word seemed to hang in the air like a lifeline, there is one crucial factor that makes humans unique among all predator species in our database. And it is this factor that I believe makes them not only safe to coexist with, but essential to our galactic community. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. The professor's tone had completely changed from warning to something that sounded almost like admiration. Class, observe these historical records from Earth. Professor Zenthka continued, manipulating the holographic display controls. The images changed to show scenes that Jake recognized from human history, but they were not the aggressive expansion patterns that had been displayed earlier. Instead, Jake saw cities with millions of people living peacefully together. He saw humans from different cultures working side by side, sharing resources and solving problems cooperatively. He saw international space stations where humans from dozens of different nations collaborated on scientific research. Humans are the only known persistence pack hunters who have learned to extend their pack identity beyond their immediate genetic relatives, the professor explained. Most pack predators limit their cooperation to family groups of 5 to 20 individuals. Human packs now number in the millions, even billions. Jake looked around the lecture hall and realized that the professor was talking about human civilization itself as a massive cooperative pack. He had never thought about cities and countries as being extensions of the same instincts that had allowed his ancestors to hunt together on the African savanna. More remarkably, Professor Zentka continued, its skin now showing patterns of gold that indicated genuine excitement and admiration. They have demonstrated the ability to extend their protective instincts to other species. The holographic display changed to show scenes that filled Jake with pride. He saw humans caring for pets, running wildlife conservation programs, and establishing protected areas for endangered species. He saw veterinarians treating injured wild animals, scientists working to save species from extinction, and ordinary people going to great lengths to help creatures that could never repay their kindness. They have taken other species under their protection, not as prey, but as what they call adopted pack members, the professor explained. They have driven themselves to near extinction, protecting other species from their own predatory instincts. Jake remembered reading about conservation efforts throughout human history. Humans had spent enormous amounts of money and effort to save whales, protect rainforests, and preserve habitats for animals that served no practical purpose for human survival. At the time, he had thought of it as simple moral responsibility. But now he saw it as evidence of something much more profound. They have learned to hunt threats instead of prey, Professor Zentka observed. They use their predatory instincts to track down diseases, environmental problems, and dangers to other species. They have turned their greatest evolutionary strength into a force for protection rather than destruction. The display showed human medical research, environmental cleanup efforts, and disaster relief operations. Jake saw humans working tirelessly to solve problems that affected not just their own species, but all life on their planet. A student from the aquatic depth-dweller species bubbled a question. But Professor, how can we be certain they will extend this protection to us? We are not from their homeworld. We have no evolutionary connection to their pack instincts. Professor Zentka's skin brightened to a warm gold color that Jake's translator indicated meant profound happiness and certainty. Because deep current flows, they already have. The professor turned to look directly at Jake, and suddenly every eye in the lecture hall was focused on him again. But this time, the attention did not feel threatening or uncomfortable. Instead, it felt almost welcoming. Jake Morrison, the professor addressed him directly, you have been on this station for 3 months. In that time, you have had access to detailed information about our defensive capabilities, our technological weaknesses, our trade vulnerabilities, and our territorial boundaries. You could have reported all of this information to your government. For strategic advantage? Jake felt his mouth go dry as he realized that the professor was right. He had indeed learned sensitive information about dozens of alien species during his time at the university. It had never occurred to him to think of it as intelligence gathering, but he could see how it might be viewed that way. Instead, Professor Zentka continued, you have spent your time learning our languages, studying our cultures, and building friendships with students from across the galaxy. You have shared your own knowledge freely, helped struggling students with their coursework, and even organized social events to help different species understand each other better. Jake remembered the study groups he had formed, the cultural exchange dinners he had arranged, and the countless hours he had spent helping other students with their research projects. He had done these things because they seemed like the right thing to do, not because of any strategic calculation. You represent a species that has learned to hunt knowledge instead of territory, the professor said, its skin now radiating patterns of gold and silver that made it look almost luminous. You pursue understanding instead of conquest. You persist in the face of cosmic loneliness until you find others to share the universe with. The professor addressed the entire class now, but continued to look at Jake as it spoke. This human has had multiple opportunities to treat us as prey, as competitors, or as obstacles to human expansion. Instead, he has chosen to treat us as pack members worthy of protection and cooperation. Jake felt tears forming in his eyes as he began to understand what the professor was really saying. The lecture had not been about the dangers of human predatory instincts. It had been about the remarkable transformation of those instincts into something positive. "Students," Professor Zenthka announced, "humans are indeed the apex predators of the galaxy. But they are apex predators who have chosen to become protectors instead of destroyers. They have learned to hunt on behalf of others rather than against them." The professor's skin was now showing the most beautiful pattern Jake had ever seen, flowing waves of gold, silver, and gentle blue that indicated joy, wonder, and deep respect. "They persist not to consume, but to guard," the professor continued. "They pursue not to destroy, but to preserve. They have taken their greatest evolutionary strength and transformed it into the greatest force for protection and cooperation that our galaxy has ever seen." Jake looked around the lecture hall and saw that the other students were now looking at him with curiosity and interest rather than fear or suspicion. Several of them were making gestures that his translator indicated were forms of greeting or welcome. "Class," Professor Zenthka concluded, "we are not in danger from humanity. We are under their protection. And that makes us the safest species in the universe." The lecture hall erupted in sounds of alien applause, clicking, buzzing, humming, rustling, and harmonic tones that blended together into something beautiful. Jake Morrison, representative of Earth's apex predators, felt truly at home among the stars for the first time since leaving his home planet.